We've been talking about the nation of Iran for so long, and also the nation of Israel, Syria. But at the end of the 2025 and looking into 2026, what can we expect and how do we understand that in the year of 2026, especially when the US is standing at the crossroads for the midterm election and also 2 years away from the presidential election 2028, putting everything together, what will be the best strategies to deal with the nation of Iran and also some of the friends in the Middle East? And what about this strategic planning under President Trump? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is the Dr. Jamsheed Choksy. Professor Choksy is a professor of Central Eurasian Studies at Indiana University, Bloomington. Professor Choksy's research broadly covers the development of societies and especially sectarian communities in Central Asia, the Near East, and South Asia study through interdisciplinary approaches involving history, religious studies, international affairs, politics, and so many more. Well, Professor Choksy, and welcome to The Missing Piece, and Merry Christmas to you and your family.
Merry Christmas to you too, and Happy New Year to you, to your family, and to all your listeners.
Thank you, Professor Choksy. Now, let's get started. It's hard to believe that we are fast approaching toward the end of 2025. And again, Professor Choksy, this won't be the last time you and I will discuss the relationship between US and Iran. But before we get to Iran, I do want to ask, let's talk about the temperature in the Middle East. And we know that in addition to Iran, the nation of Syria, the nation of Israel, and so many more, this year dominated the news, and not only because the presence of Donald Trump, and again, as I mentioned in the intro, it's about the national security. So, Professor Choksy, from your perspective, why do you think this year, under President Trump, the national security is such a concern at this moment? Is it because what's happening this year regarding the threat of the terrorists, and also regarding some of the unexpected cases arise in the Middle East? Your thoughts?
Well, that is actually very interesting, because what we've seen over the last year is, shall we say, so many issues in the Middle East all cropping up together and then becoming combined. So whether it is Gaza, Hamas and Israel, that involves Iran as well, that involves Lebanon, that involves Syria, that involves Yemen and the Houthis. The Gulf states got involved, Turkey got involved. Then we had the conflict directly between Iran and Israel, in which the US was involved. We have seen the fall of a regime in Syria, and we've seen the United States embrace the new regime in Syria, while Israel is still very cautious and in fact is concerned that the Syrian regime may return to its terrorist roots. We have Turkey and Iran also butting heads over issues like the Kurds. So the entire region is in turmoil. In addition to the civil unrest, we have environmental change. Iran is pretty much run out of water. Much of the Middle East is not just seeing very high temperatures. The predictions are that over the next couple of decades, large parts of the Middle East will be uninhabitable. So when you put all that together, and then you put into that the geopolitics of oil, which is ultimately still the largest driver of the global economy. You have, therefore, US concern, you have Russian concern, you have Chinese concern. So essentially, the three superpowers are also involved. And so it's a very complex situation. It's a situation made even more complex by nuclear issues. Iran trying to possibly get nuclear weapons, certainly claiming it wants only a civilian program. Israel already having nuclear weapons. The Saudis, the Emiratis, and others aspiring. So the entire situation, shall we say, is one that going forward, this coming year, I think will be very interesting, because a lot, as you pointed out, a lot will depend on how the US administration navigates it. But I think at this point, the US administration, which has tended over the last year increasingly to go it alone, may be better advised to work more closely with the Europeans, even with the Russians and the Chinese, even though there may be other disagreements, Ukraine, Southeast Asia, etc., you can have those other disagreements, but I think this part of the world is going to require far greater cooperation. And in ending what I'm saying, let's just point out that the now defunct JCPOA, the nuclear deal, was accomplished with the Europeans, with the Americans, with the Russians, with the Chinese, and the Iranians.
Well, again, Professor Choksy, let's talk about another piece of reality. We know that the war in Ukraine started in 2022. Now, as we're approaching 2026, we have seen little progress. I mean, again, I don't want to, put a lot of words on the table, but for Donald Trump, that the war in Ukraine was one of the crucial strategies that during his campaign and again that carried into his presidency. But at some point, American voters or American society coming to the point that getting tired of being the police of the world. And again, America today is still trying to bring Putin to the negotiation table, and Ukrainians made it really clear about the 28 points, etc. So, Professor Choksy, from your perspective, when we look at Syria, when we look at Turkey, and again look at Israel and Iran, I mean, we're going to get to the conversation a little bit deeper, but in the year of 2026, how much can we still expect that the current government or even the administration continue to be the police of the chaos? Because we know that Donald Trump is not interested in cleaning up any mess unless there's some type of reciprocity can be brought into the U.S. So from your perspective, how do we assess the measure, or how do we assess the effectiveness of the policy when we look at 2026 for Trump? Your thoughts?
One angle to that may be because particularly since President Trump approaches it from essentially the art of a deal, as he calls it. So if you're looking at it from the art of a deal, then the question is, what will the U.S. administration gain from being able to work out at least some sort of simmering down of tensions in Syria, in Lebanon, in Gaza, on the West Bank? And I think there, maybe the reciprocity comes from the Saudis, from the Emiratis, from the Qataris. In other words, they are the ones who can, shall we say, help buttress the U.S. economy in exchange for the United States taking perhaps a greater role in the region. And I think the contrast there is indeed to Ukraine, because Ukraine doesn't really have neighbors other than, of course, the EU is there, but the EU and the countries of the EU are fundamentally different in political structure from the countries of the Gulf. So the countries of the Gulf have a lot more, shall we say, to lose from instability.
Well, Professor Choksy, let's bring Iran into our conversation. Domestically speaking, we know that today when we talk about Iran, we have to talk about the missile capabilities. And so in other words, the uranium enrichment. But this is really concerning, not only for US, but also for almost the entire world. But meanwhile, that we've seen this what we called nuclear deadlock between the US and Iran for decades. So, Professor Choksy, from your perspective, how do we understand at this moment that the Trump administration tension or even the strategy to deal with the nuclear deadlock at this moment, and also throughout the entire year, how do we understand that towards the end of 2025, there has to be something be brought on the table that so the international community understand that Trump has a plan, or Trump's supposed to present a plan collectively in order to avoid what we called unnecessary disaster for 2026. What do you think of that?
Well, that's a really good point. And I think part of the problem is that the Trump administration its attention has moved away from Iran. It seems to have taken the position of, well, they bombed the Iranian sites, And so that's bought some time. And tension has moved to Ukraine, it's moved to Venezuela, it's moved to other parts of the Middle East. And that may be, shall we say, unfortunate because on the one hand it's dangerous. No one, perhaps not even the Iranians, are quite sure what has happened to the uranium stockpile after the sites were bombed. It may be entombed in there. Some of it may be sure. So that's one point. The Iranians are proceeding to develop other nuclear plants. That's the second point. However, the United States' attention has moved away, and so that's a danger. And yet, for 2026, Iran, I think, and the nuclear deal is probably the one international issue that President Trump can really achieve if he focused on it. And why do I say that? Because Iran is in deep trouble. And I'm not talking about nuclear issues or the bombing from Israel or the United States. Iran is running out of water. Tehran, the other major cities, massive unemployment, economic stagnation. The situation is so bad that the president of Iran recently made public comments that he cannot work miracles, that the local governments are going to have to deal with this. The central government essentially has thrown its hands up. So that is the situation in which Iran needs, shall we say, a bailout. Whether that bailout is directly from the United States, from the IMF, the World Bank, the Europeans, whoever, the Saudis, whatever. They need cash infusion, they need economic growth, they need employment, they need housing, they need healthcare, the list goes on. And they need desalination plants to get water. So Iran, shall we say, is backed up against the wall. And this would be the opportunity for a broad deal that brings Iran back into the world community, which is what the Iranian population wants. And I think the economic and the sort of social environmental pressures on Iran are so great right now that if there was to be a comprehensive package presented, the public outcry to take the deal will be something that the hardline fundamentalists will not be able to hold out to. So I would say and of course, such a deal would immediately diffuse a lot of the tensions in the Middle East.
Well, Professor Choksy, what about, again, I hate to bring this country in the middle of our conversation. What about China? I mean, we know that today, that from this economic standpoint, that Iran and China grow much closer. And as a matter of fact, that again, China today continue to grow economically and also from this political perspective. Surely Iran is watching closely about every single step that China takes. So from this perspective, or based on what you just said, what role does China play when we look at, or just based on what you just said, if Iran is back up against the wall, how do you think the country like China is supposed to respond, or even supposed to reach out with the olive branch? And meanwhile, we know that China, it's not going to just give out things for free and expect nothing in return. What do you think of that?
And that's a good point. Let's keep in mind that China played an important role when the nuclear deal was originally negotiated. So China is involved, has been involved. The difference is that it is difficult for China to provide, shall we say, direct economic assistance because of the distance and because it's difficult to reach Iran over land and the maritime routes running to American blockades, etc. So where China can play the role, and of course, China is not going to provide aid for nothing. But again, the United States is no longer going to provide aid for nothing. I don't think the Europeans or anyone is in such a position. So where it may be is that what the United States gets in return is a nuclear deal which stabilizes the Middle East, which helps the Europeans, helps Israel, etc. What China gets in return is more economic cooperation. In other words, I think there's a sufficiently large pie with Iran that can be divided up, because the United States is not going to provide large amounts of economic assistance. China can certainly do that. Now, that means that China's influence will grow. But at the same time, let us keep in mind that the United States is present in the Gulf in a way that China is not. So there can be a balance. That, of course, will also take, shall we say, a better understanding between the leaders of the United States and China.
Well, Professor Choksy, I want to keep our conversation going. Now, let's talk about the economic sanctions against Iran. Now, based on the article that I'm reading right now, it says the U.S. has implemented extraordinary economic sanctions against Iran. Israel, aided by Washington, has bombed Iran's infrastructure and killed military leaders, scientists, and ordinary civilians. I do want to ask, when we look at the big powers versus the weak ones, or the strong power versus the weak ones, by fact, we know that Iran today is facing more economic sanctions, but there seems to be a type of political resilience within the Iranian government, or there seems to be a lot of pushbacks within the Iranian government. What do you think that are the matters or the elements that drive the Iranian government to push forward? Is it because they know that Donald Trump is an unpredictable character? Or they know that perhaps the U.S. is going to make a major shift after the midterm election, or hopefully that after the 2028 presidential election? So what are some of the critical elements that for Iranians continue to drive forward, and despite the economic sanctions and also the limitations? Your thoughts?
When we look at it, I would suggest we look at it on a broader scale, going back, not just the Trump administration, the Biden, Obama, back. And you've seen a ratcheting up of sanctions. And the Iranian regime has always pushed back. So maybe the clue to answering that lies inside Iran. That is, the regime preservation is shall we say, the most fundamental determinant, particularly for the supreme leader and those around him. Now, that would mean that they are willing to risk the economic deterioration of the country, the social, political chaos, the environmental chaos. We've seen Iran, shall we say, it's been a downward slide. And it's been a downward slide in part because of US sanctions, but ultimately not completely because of US sanctions. There's much of Iran's problems are internal. US sanctions didn't create the water situation, didn't create the environmental situation. Iran has continued to trade with countries like China and India. We're looking at internal corruption, mismanagement, poor infrastructure, a large amount of, shall we say, internal chaos. And that internal chaos is not being rectified because the regime is fundamentally focused on, shall we say, staying in power irrespective of what happens to the population. In a sense, they're gambling that they can repress the population by military means if they need to, and we've seen them do this on several occasions over the years. Now, the question will be, can that needle be shifted in two ways? One would be to be able to work out a deal that says, okay, the regime can stay. There will be no external attempt at regime change. Of course, one cannot guarantee internal strife. Internal strife can oust a regime. We saw that happen in Syria. So maybe there's some assurance that even if there were to be a deal, that then the United States, no one else, or the EU would not move to regime change. And yet again, no guarantees that we would help the regime stay in power. if the people wanted to push it out. But I think that the regime is not willing to gamble on that. As they're afraid that if there is a deal, if there's economic change, that may galvanize the people to push the regime out. So that's part of the problem, is the regime itself is fundamentally divided.
Professor Choksy, I want to end our conversation by asking you the last question. Let's talk about the relationship between Iran and Russia at this moment. Again, based on the report, that Iran's priority in foreign policy will always be its own neighborhood. And Tehran, to be specific, try to deepen the relationship, especially in collaborating or cooperating with Russia. This is rather concerning as we're approaching the end of 2025 and looking to 2026. As I mentioned before, the war in Ukraine has already brought so much unexpected headaches upon Donald Trump and the Trump administration. But meanwhile, that we've seen that how Russia and China collaborating in a greater way, right now on top of all that Iran and Russia are also progressing collectively. So Professor Choksy, from your perspective, very briefly, how do we assess the relationship between Iran and Russia at this moment? And number two, looking into 2026, what is more concerning? Is it about the collaboration, or is it about this collective effort in terms of posing threat to the United States? Your final thoughts.
I think that the collective threat is, shall we say, one of convenience, which can very quickly dissipate. And if, for example, a deal was reached on Ukraine, that would diffuse that situation. For Iran, for the Middle East, Russia right now is a weak power. It is bogged down in Ukraine. It relies on Iran for weapons. However, when Iran supplies weapons to Russia, it may receive oil, a currency, gold, etc. in return. However, that means that Iran, therefore, is also unprotected if it were to clash again with Israel or the United States. So I think when we look at this geopolitical situation, I think that there is a relationship certainly between Iran and Russia, but that's one of mutual convenience. What we have seen largely with Russia is Russia protecting Iran on the diplomatic stage. Russia, and if I may say even China, did not come to the military assistance of Iran in the Middle East. And that's a point that needs to be taken. And Russia could have done so. China is more difficult. China's far away. Russia's right there. They could have protected Iran across the border. They did nothing. And I think that on that note, we should keep in mind that, yes, these are, shall I say, alliances of convenience. And another thing that, Donald Trump may want to offer Iran is some degree of protection.
Well, we know, Professor Choksy, Donald Trump, it's a wild card. And again, we look into 2026, that one of the crucial chapters for the country, it's a midterm election. And we've seen that how Secretary of the State Marco Rubio and work closely with Donald Trump regarding the foreign policy, even though at this moment we still don't know the result of the war in Ukraine, and also we don't know what the physiology policy towards Iran. But one thing we do know that is United States cannot single-handedly to work with the policies, and it needs help and needs the support. And again, despite the political or economic differences with some of the countries, that it's better that we have joint effort rather than going alone. Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, such an honor to speak to Professor Choksy. Professor Choksy, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. I would love to have you back on the show as we look into 2026. So thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you.